Welcome everyone to One Yom Kippur, and it's really my honor to welcome Lori Gottlieb to this conversation today that we're having on Yom Kippur. Lori is a psychotherapist. She's a New York Times bestselling author of the remarkable book, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone. She has a very renowned clinical practice, and she's also the author of the moving column in The Atlantic, Dear Therapist, as well as a contributing author to so many esteemed publications, the New York Times, and many other publications and TV shows. So I just want to thank you for joining us today on Yom Kippur.
Oh, it is my pleasure. I'm so glad to be able to have this conversation with you.
And this Yom Kippur and these high holy days are holy days like no other. Instead of being together in our communities and our sanctuaries, where each one of us at home, but instead of grieving what can't be, I think it's important for us to go deeper today and to really take the idea of Yom Kippur into its depths. And I know that you know how to go deep, Lori. So, I was first just thinking about, I wanted to take us through the whole cycle of Yom Kippur. But I guess even just to begin thinking about Yom Kippur, the Jewish way of welcoming a new year is very different from toasting with champagne and having a big party and watching a ball drop. The Jewish way of welcoming a new year involves a lot of hard work. And I thought we'd begin with Kol Nidre. And the Kol Nidre service is a service of annulling vows. And I have to imagine that it can't be that the Jewish people are not a trustworthy people and we just go around willy-nilly annulling the promises we've made, but rather that it's a service about annulling unworthy vows, lower promises that we've made to life, or maybe that we've made to ourselves. And I'd love for you to think about that with me.
Yeah, what I think of is a sense of renewal, because I think that we're asked to reflect on ourselves and ourselves in relation to others. And so when we think about promises, I think promises are the kind that you're talking about are almost like those New Year's resolutions that never last, right?
Beautiful.
I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. It's January. And they come from a place of sort of, they're an external place. And what I think we're asked to do on Yom Kippur is really to say, let me go inside. Let me go to this internal place and evaluate what matters. Evaluate, how I want to manifest in the world, how I want to be in the world, and where I haven't quite gotten there yet, where I wish I had made different choices. And it's not about self-flagellation, but I think it's so much about self-compassion. And self-compassion doesn't mean that we aren't holding ourselves accountable. Quite to the contrary, self-compassion allows us to let go of the shame that usually prevents us from being accountable to ourselves and to other people. And it allows us to really do that inner reflection.
It's so powerful. Just the idea that a new year can't be new until we're ready to look at what we're carrying and how can we release some of that so that we can actually even have any chance of a new life. It's such a powerful idea. And I've been thinking a lot about tshuva, about the Jewish idea of repentance, which involves, like you just said, going to this very deep place. And it involves soul searching. And on one hand, it's saying, yeah, you have to look at your life and look at, who have I hurt? Who have I let down? And am I ready to make that right? Who has hurt me? Who has let me down? And am I ready to make that right? And I'd love your thoughts about all of that.
Yeah.
Because I mean, you can spend years in psychotherapy with you to even touch on that. And Yom Kippur is asking you to do something in 25 hours.
Yeah. So I think when we talk about this idea of, making amends, it's really important that we think about what that actually means. And we talk about this in therapy a lot, which is, let's talk about apologies for a minute. Who is the apology for? Is it for me so that I can like dump my guilt somewhere else, right? Or is it because it will help the other person, it will heal the other person? And sometimes we aren't so honest with ourselves about who the apology is for. So what does it mean to make amends is a really good question to ask ourselves. How can we make amends in a way that is truly about making amends for the other person's benefit? And I think the same is true when we think about forgiveness. So many times we want to apologize and we expect in return some sentiment of forgiveness. And that's, what you really need to get to is a place of forgiving yourself. And again, forgiving yourself doesn't mean that you're not holding yourself accountable for how you might have harmed other people or made choices that you wish you hadn't. But it's really about having a sense of peace with yourself that's not going to come from the other person. So, I see often, for example, there was a woman that I worked with in my practice that I wrote about, and her adult children were estranged from her, and they very much, did not forgive her for how she was as a parent when they were growing up, but she had done some work on herself and she really wanted their forgiveness. And we call that forced forgiveness because they don't actually feel that. So what I said to her is that you can have compassion for someone without needing to forgive them. Her kids could come to a place where they could say, I have compassion for her struggles and what she went through, but I don't forgive her. And that doesn't make them bad people for not forgiving, right? And it actually opened up a space for them to have a relationship where she could come to a place of reckoning with herself. And that wasn't going to come from her children. So I think when we think about this question, we always think of the word forgiveness when we think of Yom Kippur, I think. And it's really about, I think, a reckoning with ourselves and the people we care about and making sure that those lines aren't blurred about taking more from them instead of giving them something that would be healing.
Wow, that's powerful. I was thinking a lot about the idea that, when we think about, who have I hurt? Who have I let down? Who have I betrayed? Sometimes that person is me.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
And that's what you're saying is that's the beginning of forgiveness, is recognizing, having compassion for the self, for just being kinder to ourselves is the beginning of everything.
Right. How have we betrayed ourselves? And I think we do that every day in this sense, which is that often when I'm giving a talk, I'll say, show of hands, who's the person that you talk to most in the course of your life? Is it your partner? Is it your parent? Is it your sibling? Is it your best friend? And I get a lot of hands for that. But when I say to people, no, actually, the person you talk to most in the course of your life is yourself. And that voice, it's just going all the time, but we don't realize it. It's kind of like just like a radio station that's playing in the background that we're not quite paying attention to, and yet we are. And usually what we say to ourselves isn't always kind or true or helpful. And so it's not. And so there was this woman that I was working with in my practice, and she was very self-critical but couldn't see it. And so I said, I want you to go home and write down everything you say to yourself in the course of a few days and come back and tell me what that voice said. And so she came back and she started to read, and she said, I can't even read this. I am such a bully to myself. And little things like, oh, you made that mistake, you're so stupid. Whereas if a friend had made the same mistake, it wouldn't occur to us to think that person is stupid. Or, oh, you look like that today, and we wouldn't blink twice if a friend we would think that our friend looks beautiful today. And so I think when we talk about, how have we mistreated ourselves, that's really important, because if we can't be kind to ourselves, and if we can't have compassion for ourselves, it's going to be very hard for us to be kind and have compassion for other people.
Yes. I actually remember when I was having writer's block in the middle of my book, I went to see a former congregant of mine who is actually a best-selling author on writer's block. And he has a beautiful book called The Tools with Phil Stutz. His name is Barry Michaels. And I went to see him and I said, Barry, I'm so stuck. He goes, Rabbi, I'll help you. And he said, tell me how you're feeling about what the last thing you wrote is. And I said, honestly, I can't even look at it.
Mm.
And he said to me, how do you think the one who wrote those words feels about what you're saying? And why would she come out to trust you? And it just kind of dovetails to what you're saying, just how often being hard on ourselves is exactly what stops us from living and from creating and from loving.
Right.
And from forgiving.
Right. And what it does is when we are so hard on ourselves that way, and when we mistreat ourselves, is we end up creating a lot of shame. And shame is a place where people hide out. Shame is a place where people tend to isolate. And we know what happens when people isolate, right? So is they start to, they start to lose what is most vital, I think, to being human, which is connection. And we're hiding. We think, oh, well, nobody else experiences this, right? So you were probably feeling ashamed. Oh, I can't, everybody else is writing, they're just humming along, but me, I can't write. And then you sort of hide out. Whereas if you just talk to any other writer, they would say, oh yeah, me too. Mm-hmm. I've experienced that too.
Yes, yes. But I love the image for me of just remembering that there is this fragile piece inside of us that we can denigrate, and so that it no longer wants to cooperate with us. It doesn't want to come out because it's afraid of us. And how gentle we have to be with it to give it permission to show itself, to show its face. And I think about on Yom Kippur, a real misunderstanding of God. Because I think too often the image of God we have on Yom Kippur is this, I see through that, you're rotten, and I'm going to decide who's good and who's rotten, and just this kind of judge. But I actually think that on Yom Kippur, of all days, the important thing is for us to be able to behold ourselves the way God sees us, which is in our fullness, in our beauty, in our potential, in our fragility.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of how we think about talking to our kids when they are struggling with something. And that, instead of shaming them, we want to bring out the parts of them that they can't see in that moment. And so it's about, your kid says, oh, I did this and I wish I had done something differently, and here's this big thing that I did. And there's so many ways to handle that. One is to be very punitive and do the finger wagging, right? Not very helpful. Another way is to help them to think through, well, let's talk about that choice that you made. Let's talk about how you decided to do what you did. And let's talk about what was going on and what might you do differently now. Because I think that when you come in with the orientation of you are good, as opposed to you are bad, right? You might have done something that was hurtful, but an act is not who the person is. So you might have done something, let's say bad, but you are not bad. And to be able to separate that out, it's easier to do when we think about doing that with our kids, let's say, but to do it with ourselves, to be much harder to separate out. I did something that I'm not proud of. I did something bad, but I am not bad.
And to me, one of the most beautiful verses of Yom Kippur is God saying, not just that you're good, but you're precious to me.
Mm-hmm.
And how often we need to hear that. And I think too often we miss that part, that we're held, that we're known, that we're loved, that we're holy, that we're precious.
Yeah, it reminds me of this moment in my book where I say to my therapist, I ask if he likes me, and he says that he does, but not for the reasons. He says, but not for the reasons that I think you want me to, like for the reasons that we all want to be like, hey, look at me, I'm so, smart and funny and entertaining, or whatever the reasons that out in the world we want people to like us. He said, I like your nishama. And what he was saying to me was, it was your essence, like your that includes your struggles, your blind spots, the ways that you kind of navigate through the world that are problematic. Even with all that, in fact, not despite, but because of, right? I like your essence, and I think that when we can see the nishama in ourselves. And also in others, that I think when we can really actively look for that and say, wait a minute, I'm going to look past this incident or this action or this interaction that we had, and I'm going to look and really stay focused on that person's nishama. Everything sort of changes in terms of what those relationships look like and how you do what we call rupture and repair, especially as we talk about Yom Kippur. That there are always going to be ruptures. And then the question is, well, how do you repair that? What does that look like? How do you take responsibility? How do you approach the other person? How do you perspective take and say, I see you, I hear you, I understand you in a way that I didn't at that time?
It's very, what you're saying is very moving to me. What it means to see someone's soul. Mm-hmm. And to see your own, because to me, that's the beginning of hope. It's the beginning of hope for repair, and it's the beginning of hope to escape that sense that each of us has, no matter how many years we're married or whatever it is, how many children you can have. There's this sense in which we all feel worried that we're not heard, that we're not seen, and that there's hope for repair, and that hope involves connection. I see you. I see the totality of you. I see you with all your imperfections, and with your imperfections, you're more beautiful to me, not less beautiful. You're more beautiful.
Right. And to be able to see the beauty in our flawed humanity. And that's where we're going back to what we were talking about earlier. If you can have more compassion for yourself, and that includes all of these things that maybe you feel you want to hide from other people, right? But when you actually take off that mask and you let people see that, then they can really see your beauty. And if you have compassion for yourself, you'll be able to take off that mask, and you'll be able to create the space and the safety for others to take off their mask around you. And when we talk about connection, that's what we're talking about.
Yes. Yes. And I think on Yom Kippur, the rabbis envision that part of that is an unmasking on the part even of God. See me. You know, they say, seek God when God is near, and that there's this sense of the possibility of maybe touching, even for a fraction of a second, something sublime, something sacred, something, an awareness that's so much greater than what you've been holding on to. And that's just kind of got your vision with blinders on.
Yeah, it's almost like, I think a lot of times we talk about a sort of a pervasive loneliness in our culture. And I think that what's underneath that is a longing, and it's a longing for what you just said. It's a longing to touch that beauty. It's a longing to touch that sense of, you can call it what you want, hope, vitality, connection, but it's a sense that we lose in our day-to-day lives. And now is a time for us to say, I'm going to slow down for today. I'm going to reflect for today. I'm going to try to touch that place of beauty in God, in myself, in others. And then can we not just do it that day, but can we take that and carry that out, you know, in our daily lives in some way, in some realistic way? It shouldn't just happen once a year. You know, it's nice that we have the ritual and the tradition of being able to slow down and do that. But I also think that there's something to be learned from that, which is, you know, how do we carry this out throughout the year so that next Yom Kippur, we can look back and say, I carried that more during the year, and it changed the quality of my life.
Beautiful. You know, from a mystical sense, there's this idea that what you experience on Rosh Hashanah, or what you experience on Yom Kippur, isn't just this moment, this day, but rather that it has the power to shed light on this new year, on the entirety of the year. That Yom Kippur can give you the power of repair throughout the year. And you've spoken and about this, just that change comes, that the transformation comes not from some grand gesture, but from tiny movements that ripple out from there. And speak to that a little bit.
Right. You know, change is really hard. And I think that people, you know, wonder, well, why is it so hard to change? I know what I need to do to change, and I can't get myself to do it. And first of all, I think it's partly what you said, which is that, you know, most changes come about, most of the significant changes in our lives come about from the tiny, almost imperceptible steps that we take along the way. So it's not one big change that happens at once. Sometimes looks like that because there are different stages of change. There's, you know, it's not the Nike just do it, which would be nice, but it doesn't really work that way. There's a lot of like pre-contemplation, thinking about the change, contemplating the change, preparing for the change, some of which you're not even aware of is happening. And then you get to this place where you make the change. But the most important stage of change is actually after you make the change, and it's called maintenance. And it's maintaining the change. And the thing about maintenance is it doesn't mean that you're going to, all of a sudden, you have made the change, you're never going to slip back into whatever happened pre-change. You are human, and you're going to regress sometimes. And what happens is the first time that someone feels like, oh, I slipped up, right? Then they say, oh, I can't make that change. That was too hard, so I give up. And what's problematic about that is that it's normal during maintenance, which is always, right, that you're going to sometimes slip up. And so you just have to go back to the place of, okay, that happened. Again, self-compassion. And now I'm going to go back and go back to my maintenance phase, and just be really gentle with yourself around that. And that will help you maintain the change. The thing about change is that even with positive change, change is tied to loss. You're giving up what you have. You're giving up the status quo. And even if the status quo is something that you want to change, let's say the status quo isn't optimal, even if it's miserable and you're going to something better, you're still giving up what you know. And humans don't do well with uncertainty. And so every time we make a change, we're giving up the thing we know, even if the thing we know isn't great, for something we don't know that we think will be better, but we don't know because we haven't done it yet. And that's where people get tripped up.
Yes, indeed. You've written about this, and I just kept thinking about the children of Israel in the wilderness. I mean, here they are, they're out of Egypt. They're out of slavery, but the wilderness is frightening, and they're not in the promised land. They've been promised some promised land, but they're not there. So what do? They keep saying, let's go back.
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, let's go back to certain slavery, because what this is right now, this feels worse than 100% subjugation. They start romanticizing Egypt because being in this uncertain space is just too uncomfortable. And I think it's also speaking to all of us right now during this pandemic, this discomfort we have with it was supposed to be 3 weeks of shelter in place, not 5 months, not 6 months, not, when is there going to be a vaccine? And just this sense in which we have this longing to return even to a bad path rather than be patient with uncertainty so that we could get to a new place.
Yeah, it's that image of, sort of being on the way to the promised land and then wanting to go back reminds me of something that I wrote about, which was, it's this cartoon, and it's of a prisoner who's shaking the bars and desperately trying to get out, but on the right and the left it's open, right? No bars. So the prisoner isn't actually in jail. And that's so many of us. This is what my therapist brought that to me, because we so often feel like, we feel trapped in our circumstance, and yet we have the freedom to just go around, look to the right, look to the left. It's open, go. But we don't. Why? Why do we want to go back to servitude, right? Why do we want to be in jail? Because with freedom comes responsibility. And so if we walk around the sides, if we go into this place, now we're responsible for our decisions and choices. So it's so much easier to say, I'm trapped, I'm in jail. It's so much easier to go back to Egypt, in certain ways, because you don't have those choices. Choice can be paralyzing in some ways, because all of a sudden now you're going to go into a place of uncertainty and you're going to be responsible for the outcome.
Yes. I remember when I first read that the word decide is connected to homicide. And I never read that before. I never understood that before. But until you're ready to kill the other options, then you're never going to move forward. You have to be ready to say, I choose this person. I choose this path, or else it's just going to be, I just want to leave all my options open. And then you have nothing.
Well, right. So the act of not choosing is making a choice.
Yes.
That's, we were talking about that this week on my podcast, where said this couple couldn't make a decision about something where they're going to raise their kids. And so they just kept like waffling back and forth. And I said, you are raising your kids right now by not deciding. You've actually decided. You're in this city right now. And so, and if you don't make a choice, they're going to be in college and you're going to say, oh, wait, we never made a choice on where we were going to raise our kids.
Right.
So many times we're so paralyzed, we're so afraid to kill off the other choices, you said. And when we say homicide, there's grief. It's a death. You gave something up. It's a death. And so you have to be able to grieve that loss in order to fully embrace the path that you've chosen. And people who can't do that just say, I got to hold both options. I can't decide between both options. And then they're left with nothing.
Yeah. I guess you saying it's a death leads me to another piece of Yom Kippur is confronting our mortality. Who by fire, who by water. And believe me, I in no way believe that that's something that God picks for us. I don't think that God is the bringer of plagues. But I do think that it's very important on Yom Kippur and every day of life to confront that we're here for a very short period of time and to confront mortality.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that that's a theme that runs through your work.
Oh, it does, definitely. In my book, I write about the experience of this young woman in her 30s who comes back from her honeymoon and she finds out she has cancer, and later it turns out that she's going to die from this cancer. And she asked me if I'll stay with her until she dies. And it's this experience where it really forced me to look death in the eye in a way that most of us, myself included, tend to avoid in our daily lives. But what she said to me at one point was, she started doing all of these things that some people thought, well, why do you want to spend your days doing this, when you have such limited time? And what we realized was we were sort of envious of her, of making these choices that she could make. And she said, well, why does somebody need a terminal diagnosis to live their lives the way they want to? And even with COVID now, I think people are experiencing that, where they're saying, wait a minute, I'm realizing what's important to me, what's not important to me, what I can let go of. And as we emerge from this, when we do emerge from this, what can I prioritize? How can I live every day with more intention instead of sort of sleepwalking or passively going through life? And so I think when we kind of keep death on one shoulder, and I don't mean in a debilitating way, but in an invigorating way, in a way that helps us to live more fully, in a way that gives us the sense of vitality of the fact that I have a limited time here. And by the way, it's kind of like life has 100% mortality rate, and that's not just for other people. We don't like to think about that. But just knowing that life does have a 100% mortality rate, and most of us don't know how or when we're going to die. And so with that in mind, how can that help us to live more fully now? How can we say, right now we're thinking about with COVID, who and what is important to me? What are the relationships that I really want to nurture? What are the other aspects of my life that are really important to me that I haven't given due time to? And I think that it shouldn't take a global pandemic or a terminal diagnosis for us to live that way.
I think that's part of what Yom Kippur is asking us to do, is to imagine that we have no time, so that we can emerge from the day with this sense of a rebirth, a resurrection, like, oh, wow, I was given a second chance at life. How do I want to live it today? I've been given a second chance. It was almost like I was given that terminal diagnosis, and then the doctor said, actually, we were wrong. The test was wrong. You have more time.
Yeah.
How do you want to live it?
Right. And what happens is how quickly we say, for the first few weeks of being given more time, we say, oh, look, I'm going to live my life this way. And then we slip back into kind of the old way of being. And so
which is the question I have for you as a therapist, is true change really possible? On one hand, I say, of course it is, because how many people have I counseled who were drug addicts, alcoholics, serial cheaters, any number of things, and they're not anymore. They're not. And yet so many of us, like, as you said, make the same resolutions year after year, or you could look at your journal from 3 years ago and it just points to the same issues you've been working on. And yet we do know change is possible because we've witnessed it in our lives. We've seen somebody who hit something in their lives and actually changed, sort of like the rabbis say, you know, when somebody really is about tshuva, when they really change, they're a new person.
That's right. So I see the joy of my job is that I get to see people change all the time. And I get to see what I think are really heroic moments happen in the therapy room where someone does something that they were never able to do before, and they keep doing it. And then it becomes part of their being. It becomes part of who they are. So I think that when we're talking about, can people really change? Absolutely. But they have to be ready, and it has to do with readiness. So when someone comes into the therapy room, I'm interested in not just why they're there, why did you come here today? But I want to know why now? Why this day, this week, this month, did you pick up the phone and make that call, even if this problem has been going on for years, right? So why now? Because they're ready for change. And even if they don't know it, right? Because sometimes they might come in and say, oh, this isn't working in my life and I want you to change my partner. I want you to change my mother. I want you to change my child, whatever. But what they soon come to realize is, no, actually, I'm here because I need to look at my own role in all of this, right? Yeah. And so that's where you look at, what is this person's strength? Because it's not just that they're coming in for a problem, but there was some strength in them that said, I'm ready. I'm going to make this call. I don't know what I'm signing up for yet. I don't know what I'm ready for yet, but I'm ready for something. And those are the people who change.
Beautiful. I'm just sitting that. It's just a beautiful idea.
And
maybe part of it is also just there's this rabbinic idea, we say the Shema and then it says, put the words on your heart. I don't know if you've ever heard this. It says, put the words on your heart. And the question is, why not in your heart? Why on your heart? And the rabbinic answer is, sometimes the heart is closed. It's not ready. So put the words on your heart and keep them there. Because when the time is right, the heart will open and the words will enter and they will nourish you just when you need them most. And so you can never tell when, Lori Gottlieb is going to talk on Yom Kippur today, and she's going to say something that you needed to hear today. And you might not have heard it yesterday. You might not have been able to hear it 6 months ago, but today a crack was open and you were able to take it in. And I just think it's so important to just remember that sometimes it's a piece of wisdom that you heard 3 years ago that suddenly you're like, now I see. Now I see what he meant. Now I see. Now I can hear it and feel it. And now I can allow it to change me.
Right. And I think sometimes people think that the readiness will just appear one day. And sometimes it does. But I also think that we can take an active role in helping ourselves to become more ready. And that goes back to this idea of having agency in our own lives. That's not to say that there aren't difficult circumstances this year, if anything has shown us that, but we've known that, since the beginning of humanity, that life is hard. And so there are difficult circumstances, and there's certainly difficult people. I remember when I was training, one of my mentors said, before diagnosing someone with depression, make sure they aren't surrounded by assholes, if I can say that on this, but, and so of course there are difficult people, but then what is our role in that, right? So, how do we respond to our circumstances and to the people around us? And are we contributing to the difficulty around us? And are we being sort of the victim? Or are we saying, wait a minute, even though this is hard, even though there are parts of this I can't change, here are the parts that I can. Here's the part where I still have agency. At the very least, I can change the way that I think about this. I can change the way I can move myself from victim to hero. And I can see what happens when I become the protagonist in my own story, instead of having the protagonist go around in circles and never get anywhere. So even those changes, lead you to another place of readiness that wouldn't necessarily have happened if you just waited for readiness to sort of come down and land upon you.
Beautiful. And it does so much have to do with the storyline, which I know fascinates you. Just the whole story we tell ourselves, the narrative of our lives, and what character we play, and how that can shift over time. And I think Judaism and the Torah and all of our books are really, they're asking us to learn through story and to see ourselves as part of a very big story, and how that can give us strength.
Yeah, it's interesting. I did a TED Talk recently about the idea of what it does when we tell ourselves certain stories, and then what happens when we edit them. And I was talking about the fact that I come from a writing background and then became a therapist. And I feel like a lot of the time what I do as a therapist when I'm sitting in that chair is I'm editing. I'm actually using my writing background, because we're all unreliable narrators. And that doesn't mean that we're purposely misleading. It means that we're all telling a story through the lens of our own perspective. And so when people come in, they're emphasizing certain parts of the story, they're minimizing other parts of the story, they're leaving certain details out, they're, narrating it in a certain way to get you to sort of validate their version of the story. And when I see couples, especially, I get to see both versions of the story. And it's really interesting to see how two people can see the exact same thing from very different perspectives, and yet also agree on something that they didn't realize they agreed on. And so what I think is important is to know that the way that we're looking at the world in this particular moment, in any particular moment, is simply our version of a story, and that there are many other versions of the story, and that we get to choose what version of the story we're going to go along with, right? So, because if you're going along with a certain version of a story and it leads you to a dead end and you're stuck, well, the plot, you're just stuck in that plot. It's not moving you anywhere. So is there another version of the story? Can you rewrite the story? Can you broaden the perspective so that now there's a way to move on to the next chapter? It's like what you were talking about with writer's block a little bit, that sometimes we write ourselves into a corner. And we do that all the time in the version of the story that we are holding so dear. And if we can say, wait a minute, there's another version of this story too. And in this version of the story, I actually have choices. In this version of the story, I have agency. And so maybe I'm going to rewrite it like this.
I'm curious what aspects of your Jewishness feed in to you being a therapist, and how you are a therapist, or how you write. Do you feel that there's part of your unique inheritance that makes you the healer that you are?
I think that there's something very core about this idea of, in Judaism, how we look at history and story and the world around us, and how we make sense of it, and this idea of connectedness and what is our place in the world. And all of those themes come into, no matter what people, who comes into therapy, no matter what they believe, no matter what spiritual practice they have. I think what happens is people start to say, wait a minute, let me look at the world through this lens. And I don't think that Jews have the monopoly on this, but I think it's very much what I grew up with, and very much I think what my son has learned as he's gone through his Jewish education as well.
I was also thinking about the title. Maybe you should talk to someone, because I wrote a book called Talking to God. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about what what it means to talk to God, what prayer means to you.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the title of the book, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, while it's a nod toward when you want someone to go to therapy, maybe you should talk to someone. I think what it really means is maybe we should talk more to one another, and in a real way. And I think by talk, I mean listen.
Mm-hmm.
So when we use that word talk, often what happens is, I remember when at one point one of my mentors said, like, when we were just starting off as therapists and we would talk too much in the room. And she said, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. There's a reason for that ratio. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. And so I think that talking means often listening, and listening doesn't mean coming up with what you're going to say while the other person's still talking, coming up with your defense, saying, wanting to share this brilliant thought or idea, so you're not really listening to what the other person is saying. Listening is, I always say that, like, I'm listening for the music under the lyrics. The lyrics are the content of what someone is saying, and the music is, what is the underlying struggle or pattern that got this person into this situation in the first place. And so, often even in couples, you see this where somebody says, hey, I want to talk about this. And the person says, okay. And instead of listening, they don't really know how to help. So if you could say at the beginning of the conversation, here's what I really want out of this conversation. Mm-hmm. I just want to vent, or mm-hmm. I want you to help me brainstorm, or mm-hmm. I want a hug. Or I just want to see if you can understand me, whatever it is, or I actually want you to come up with this, help me come up with a solution, right? Yes. That helps you listen. But then so when you talk about, talking to God or talking to one another, I think it's a profound experience of wanting to be heard. When we're talking, we're saying, I'm revealing myself to you. And can I trust you with this revelation? Can you hold this revelation? You used the word fragile earlier. I would say fragile sort of, to me, implies something that is breakable. To me, I would say tender might be a word that I would prefer, where it's, I'm going to reveal this more tender part of myself. And can you hold that with me? So when we say maybe you should talk to someone, that's the experience that I'm alluding to.
And that we can have that with God and trust that it's not a monologue.
Yes.
Maybe in terms of all the areas of Yom Kippur that requires to go someplace that we don't want to go every day. We don't want to look at our shortcomings every day. We don't want to look at the relationships that we might have had a hand in destroying or hurting. We don't want to look there. And another place that we don't always want to go when we've had loss is to spend time remembering the people we've loved and lost. And that's the Isker service. And I'd love for you to speak a little bit about that, about the importance, the power, the healing that can come from spending time remembering our dead, talking to our dead, forgiving our dead, asking forgiveness from our dead, and what that intimate Yisker time is all about to you.
Yeah. When you talk about losing people, I feel like the people who have really touched us are carried inside of us. And so my father died in March, and I was very, very close with him. And,
I'm
I
so
talked
sorry.
to him. Thank you. I talk to him every day. And, it's newer right now. So I don't know if I will talk to him always with this frequency. I know I'll always be in dialogue with him. And that's because he lives inside of me. I carry him with me. And is it, it's sort of this bittersweet kind of loss, where there's the excruciating pain of not having him here, but there's also that part of him that I feel so close to still, that I think I will always feel close to. And so I think sometimes people don't want to think about the people that they've lost because of that excruciatingly painful part. But there's another side to it also, which is how much you loved them and they loved you. And that means in all the imperfections too. So a lot of times people have regret, right? Oh, you know, I should have done this. I wish I had done this. In my Dear Therapist column, I get letters all the time of people saying, like, I wish I had said this to this person before they died. I wish that they knew this, right? And then how do you make sense of that in the context of the entirety of the relationship, and not just that one thing or those two things or those 20 things, whatever they are? Because that person had an effect on you. That person changed you and you changed them, and your lives were different because of each other, even in their imperfections. So I think it's really important to spend time with the people that we have loved and who have and who continue to inform who we are in the world.
You know, the Rambam, the Maimonides, actually in the Laws of Tshuva, he says that if you need to ask forgiveness from someone who's no longer here, you can go to the cemetery and perform this ritual of asking forgiveness of the dead, that it's not over. I mean, what he's saying is it's not over, that just because they've left this plane doesn't mean they've left, and that you still have the power to set it right, to say the words you need to say. And I've definitely worked with people on that, and it's been a huge healing for people to be able to go through that process.
Right. You're still working on those relationships and working through those relationships, even though the person isn't physically here.
Yeah. Yeah. And the final service of Yom Kippur is called Ne'ilah, and it's this service. You know, we've been fasting. You know, we're tired, we're hungry, we're thirsty. You know, we've done our best to look at ourselves, and it isn't easy. And then you get to this last place, and it's not watching a ball drop. You know, it's this place of intimacy with, well, maybe you're calling it the tenderness. It's this place of intimacy within you, within everyone around you, and with the soul of all souls too. Just this very pure place, the ability to have that moment, that final shofar blast, that cleanse. Can you speak to us a little bit about that, about just having the opportunity to touch that place, even if you know you're going to close right back up afterwards, but what it means to just experience that?
Yeah.
And I know we can't always live there.
Right. But I think every time you go there, you create more space around it to come back. And so it's not, I don't think it happens once a year. I think that what you're doing is you're opening the space a little bit more so that you can visit a little bit more often and with more ease.
Yes. Yes. I'm going to say a big yes to that. That once you've touched it, you want to know more about it, and you want to find it again. And now you know the road. You know the road there.
And also you realize that it's whatever you were concerned about, whatever hesitation you had, whatever fear you had about going there, you realize, wait a minute, this actually feels really good.
Yeah. And sometimes we have to be willing to have fear so that we can go to the place that we're fearing. Because once we get there, we realize I meant to have this experience, and the fear melts away.
Yeah, I say that a lot with people who are afraid to feel certain feelings. And what I tell them is that often the fear of the feeling is the fear of the feeling is often scarier than the feeling itself. That when you get there, you realize, oh wait, I built up all of this, anxiety around this. And when I got there, it wasn't like that at all. It actually felt good. It actually felt whole. It actually felt authentic.
So I think maybe my final question to you is simply, what does Yom Kippur mean to you? And can you describe even an experience that you've had that remains with you?
So I think that a lot of people think of Yom Kippur sort of like Dobby and Harry Potter, right? Like bad Dobby, right? Like, and then you're supposed to feel all this guilt, and then every time you feel the guilt, you've got to like hit yourself, right? And I always try to explain to people, especially people who aren't Jewish, and they're like, what are you doing today? What is this holiday, right? What is this experience? It is not Dobby and Harry Potter. No. And so I think it's what we've been talking about today, which is it's really about a time to say, I really want to reflect upon my world. And it's not a navel gazing activity. It's very much about your connectedness and how you relate to people and who are the people in your life. And so it's not, I think it's not so much about, I think it's a very communal experience. I don't think it's so much an individual experience. It's about you in relation to others. And I think it's a really good time to think more broadly about what we were talking about earlier with my patient who said, why do we need a terminal diagnosis to really live with intention? How can we live with intention? What does that mean? Can we kind of evaluate where we are with our intentionality? Can we step back today and do that? So that's what it means to me.
It's beautiful. I guess I'd like to end with a blessing. And I want to thank you for having such a powerful conversation with me today on Yom Kippur. And I want to bless you, and I want to bless everyone joining us today with a year of health, most importantly, and a year of joy, a year of openness to going to that tender place, a year of love, a year of connection, a year where we recognize we don't need a terminal diagnosis to be true to ourselves, and a year where we do reach out to talk to someone to make those real connections, these real nishama connections in God's light and in blessing. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Lori.
It was a real honor to spend this time with you today.
Me too. I think you just raised so many powerful themes, and you just took it deeper. So I want to thank you for that.